Thank you so much for that warm introduction. I must admit it is more than a wee bit intimidating to follow Tim Wengert, who I am fairly certain could indeed answer all of your questions, though I would hesitate to make such a claim for myself. Now, when I heard this morning's introduction from Vincent, I thought, now I understand why they have invited me. They want to know that it really is no worse than it ever was, and that in fact they have it much better than their predecessors when we dig beneath the surface. I am going to take you from the lofty intellectual Latinate heights that Dr. Wengert led us through and his wonderful rhetorical flourish, and I am going to take you down in the dirt, quite literally, of the schoolhouse scuffles and skirmishes in both Reformation Germany and then in the colonial mid-Atlantic that served as the origins for Lutheran education in the early modern period. And thus, it might seem odd to start with Sesame Street, but I was delighted to see that it was indeed the 50th anniversary, because in my case, the parallels are so apt. In 1969, the Children's Television Workshop set about to prepare the broadest swath of American youth for kindergarten by teaching them their numbers, letters, and tolerance before they boarded buses to recently desegregated schools. As children grew accustomed to the multicolored cast of humans, animals, and monsters, CTW hoped the parents who watched with them would be similarly drawn to the benefits of a multicolored world. Martin Luther and Henry Muhlenberg agreed with Big Bird et al. That those who control the curriculum control the body politic. They would have underscored that the learning that matters most happens at home, where children teach their parents. The fundamental premise that children can, should, and will inculcate orthodoxy in parents informed the Lutheran educational enterprise as it attempted to drive out the relics of Catholic and Zwinglian practice in 16th century Württemberg. Henry Muhlenberg depended upon children again to gain control over parents too willing to follow Moravians and Calvinists in colonial Pennsylvania. In between, to the north, Puritans institutionalized the practice with a particularly clever nickname when they came up with the halfway covenant to rescue their grandchildren's souls from the children they thought had fallen short of salvation in the New World. Lutheran experience in 16th century Germany has played itself out again and again in North America and around the globe as cultural power brokers have deployed educational institutions as mechanisms for socioeconomic, cultural, and political change. Now, you've already heard from a more learned person than I about the Augsburg Confession, but I would like to situate it within the timeline of the village schools with which I have spent 25 years in the archives and have come to share with you. So the Reformation undermined the social disorder that had reigned to some degree since the fall of the Roman Empire. Christianity in Western Europe had been defined by and in Rome. Luther's audacity in translating the Bible into the vernacular and asserting the need for individual access to divine truth upended not only church authority but also state authority. The Peasants' Rebellion of 1525 demonstrated to elites, including Luther, that the power unleashed by his theology. Before worshipers could be entrusted to read and interpret the word, they decided in the aftermath, someone needed to teach the great unwashed them to do so and avoid the radical reinterpretation of Luther's theology that led Swabian peasants to think they could pick their own pastors, let alone engage in radical social experiments such as the Commune of Münster. Melanchthon's Augsburg Confession was intended to protect against wayward interpretations of Holy Writ and to ensure that the Lutheran impulse to literacy remained bounded by doctrinal legitimacy. Now, Dr. Wengert told me if he didn't like these pictures, he would let me know. I will not go into the details of Erasmian and Melanchthonian pedagogy because you've just had a far more detailed and refined accounting than I could give. But 25 years after the Peace of Augsburg established the right of the ruler to determine religious confession in his category, the intricate integrated application of Erasmian humanism to Lutheran theology remained, as you just heard, a constant in Lutheran Latinate education. However, Luther's promise of education for every boy and girl demanded what contemporary educational theorists would call a differentiated curriculum. In other words, every child needed a catechism, but not every child needed Latin. In Württemberg, Johannes Brentz, the chappie on the right, drafted the Ravensburg Catechism in 1546. And as you will see, while detailed, it is not lofty. Wake early, straighten hair, wash hands, pray for mercy, go to lessons all day, pay attention to teacher, fear God in all things, honor, serve, belong to, love, and follow rulers. In Württemberg, Johannes Brentz took charge of adapting Lutheran theology beyond the confines of elite Latin schools to vernacular training in good daily practice. And every parent in the room knows we appreciate when someone else tells the kids to wash their hands. The subtle integration of Erasmian humanism seemed too risky for rural children, where the inculcation intended was as much, if not more, behavioral than intellectual. Both Brentz and the Duke hoped catechetical dictums to obey one's betters taught to children in the classroom would translate into hearthside injunctions at home for parents to obey their prince. A cadre of confessionally pure catechists and pastors would need to oversee such classrooms and identify the rare soul worthy of further education, first at a Latin school and then at the University of Tübingen to fortify pastoral ranks. Now comes the fun part. I've just spent a lot of time going back and mapping every visitation note that I could find on this 1596 map of Württemberg. So those of you who have done your genealogy can come to me later and ask which drunken minister or which misbehaving boys came from your ancestors' hometown. And Duke Christoph of Württemberg pledged to mold a devout Lutheran state from Zwinglian, Catholic, and Lutheran rivals who had been trading influence and territory for over 3 decades in the region. In 1556, he turned monasteries into Latin schools, and the Great Church Ordinance of 1559 codified Lutheranism as the territorial church with regulations about vernacular schools, clerical examinations, and village visitations. Christoph died in 1568, but his successor, Duke Ludwig, instituted a statement of concordance in 1577 during what scholars have described as the Second Reformation, aka the period during which institutionalized Calvinism was on the rise, and dispatched visitors in 1581, 1585, and 1590 to check on the state of faith from Stuttgart streets to Black Forest barns. So what I find interesting, and let's see, they taught me how to point. Here we go. So down here in the Black Forest are the most interesting anecdotes of what's going on when they get to those Black Forest barns. But I also appreciate Textor in Schorndorf, who kept writing in, being turned in for abuse of the youngest students in his Latin schools, to the point that the visitors went in and took down notes of what the children said, and they entertained them with tales of their dreams in which they took over the classroom and got their revenge. But the scope of where they're traveling in that period, I still find, I live in Chicago where we have a current teachers strike. The fact that they were in fact managing to cover such a broad territory with so many different tasks in the period is impressive. What visitors found, and you see this is a period few years later, even the map is more detailed. They're sort of taking control over the geography. Is clear. What visitors found and recorded certainly strayed from the utopian bliss of pious shepherds guiding orderly flocks towards meritocratic education and salvation. By contrast, lackluster teachers led those reviewing visitation notes in Stuttgart to wonder if Black Forest farmers really needed instruction after all, while pastors begged for transfers to better pulpits and Latin school admissions for their sons. In towns, the tradesmen and women some of you may have read about in Lyndall Rover's Holy Household were more interested in numeracy than in doctrine to train the next generation. A good tailor could teach numbers and letters to parent satisfaction, if not doctrine to the consistory's standards. And similarly, they're not being paid well. Sound familiar? And their chronic complaints, particularly down Kolb-Zavelstein and down in this area, that how they're supplementing their income is working as scribes because they are literate, and so they can make extra income. But then if someone else comes in and sets up as a scribe, they write in and say, you got to get me someplace else. I can't make enough money on what you pay me, and I'm not getting my writing gigs anymore. 2 generations after Luther removed the necessity of celibacy, schoolmasters had learned that marriage to the pastor's daughter provided a path to promotion, and the offspring of such unions were more likely to be found meritorious of Latinate education and a sojourn at the Tübingen Stift than their Schwetzing Schwäbisch neighbors. Now, I spend this time looking at what's going on in Württemberg, despite having been introduced as an Americanist, because it is from Swabia that the bulk of our colonial Pennsylvanian forebears come, to the extent that I love this map, which labels New Swabia. Now, you have to turn it around, because it is not, that's north. I don't know early modern maps. They're always fun, they're not always accurate. But basically, Pennsylvania is New Swabia on this map, as opposed to New Belgium and New Netherlands. And the Schwetzing Schwabs, those with whose Lutheran allegiance worried their dukes in the 16th century, would form the migratory basis for much of colonial North America's mid-Atlantic and cause consternation for theologians and politicians with grand pedagogical schemes for confessional and political control. Such new Schwabs in what would become Penn's Woods were not the only Lutherans on American shores. New Sweden and New Netherlands had had their fair share of Lutheran souls drawn together across geographic and doctrinal boundaries as they moved through Europe and across the Atlantic. In 1703, the Swedish consistory called the first Lutheran minister ordained in North America, Justus Faulkner, away from his hermit's cave along the Wissahickon in Pennsylvania to care for Lutherans, in his terms, lost among the libertines, in the confessional and cultural chaos of colonial New York City, aka Sesame Street, and would soon dispatch his drunken brother Daniel to New Jersey. Again, things don't change. And the longer list of those with whom Justus was challenged to draw into the Lutheran fold were Quakers, Anabaptists, naturalists, rationalists, independents, Sabbatarians, and secret insinuating sects. Because the Americans surrounding him, his dictum was to live for yourself and do as it please you. But Justus himself demonstrates the outcome of that previous schooling age I described in Württemberg. He was a member of the hereditary clergy. He was a third-generation cleric. His grandfather and father preceded him, and both he and his brother entered into the call. To give a better sense of just how confused this world is, and I doubt there, well, we played with it to see if I can indeed blow it up closer for you. This is now the point that if you want to know who had a drunk pastor in the 18th century in the pulpit you inhabit now, I can tell you that afterwards as well. Or who had particularly unruly schoolboys. So this is the area in which we are dealing in the sort of nascent predecessor of the Philadelphia Ministerium. And I always think that the life of Conrad Weiser best illustrates the mix that embodies the amalgam. He was born in Württemberg, in Herrenberg, on the map I had up before, died in Pennsylvania, but he passed through London and New York, perpetually shifting his religious allegiances along the way. And while Weiser was a teen, freezing and starving as he tried to learn the Mohawk language that got him most of his fame up here in Onondaga one summer, Albany's Wilhelm Birkenmeier was begging for firewood, dispatching drunks, including Daniel Faulkner, and berating bigamists up and down the Hudson Valley on behalf of the Amsterdam Consistory. And if you have not treated yourself to the Albany Protocol, sometime when you think you have it hard, treat yourself to the Albany Protocol. Because trying to figure out how to institutionalize Lutheranism when folks are coming from all of these different ports of call, bigamy was huge. Because you showed up, you fell in love with someone new, and you just didn't mention the previous spouse. And the ministers had a terrible time tracking that down. They also had a terrible time because getting paid was hard and finding a minister was hard. So the likes of Weiser and everyone in this region, if someone came by who was literate and said they would baptize your child, you would let them baptize your child. You did not look for ordination papers. And frankly, you didn't care. You wanted your child baptized. This makes Birkenmeier insane when he shows up, called by the Amsterdam Consistory, and then it makes Henry Muhlenberg insane yet again, another couple decades later. So people talk about church shopping now, but you couldn't shop because you would take whoever came by. And it might be a Moravian who called themselves a Lutheran. It might be a tailor who called themselves a schoolmaster or a pastor. And if you are concerned for your children's soul and you want to be married in the eyes of God, you will let any of these folks give you, perform the ceremony and give you the solace you seek. And that is what is going on throughout this region. But you also have formalized competition among the various interpretations of Lutheranism across Amsterdam, Hamburg, Halle, and Tübingen, as they set things in motion. So Weiser, again, to final drift to the south, in his 20s he married. He had his children baptized, as I said, by anyone who came by, including Wilhelm Birkenmeier, and in his 30s he moved south to not that far from here, down the Schoharie Valley to Tulpehocken. And there, he became the touch point in the foundation of colonial Lutheranism, because much to his future father-in-law's chagrin, he flirted with Moravians and in fact briefly divorced his wife and became a brother of the Ephrata cloister. It was a theological Wild West, if you will. Now, the Halle agenda. I am fairly certain that those of you educated in this seminary and around have a good grasp of Halle, but I'm going to dare to revise it in pedagogical principles instead. So August Hermann Francke set up what was a dream in terms of this differentiated meritocratic education in Halle, Germany. He had a Waisenhaus orphanage charity school, a school for tradesmen and housewives, a school for civil servants, and a Latin school praetorium, everyone drawing towards what they thought their future career would be, but with the possibility that the orphan who showed up at the Waisenhaus just to learn numbers and letters, if he showed talent, might rise up through the ranks and end up being a professor at the Stift, a pastor in the sort of Latinate elite of the Lutheran clergy. Henry Melchior Muhlenberg arrived as a missionary from Halle. I defer to Dr. Wengert, but I believe he wanted to go to India and got the short straw, so he came to Pennsylvania instead, kind of like Christopher Columbus getting things confused. But he came with his proper paperwork and pedagogical pedigree to find Pennsylvania absolutely roiled by rival factions of Swabs and Swedes, mystics and Moravians, Dutch Calvinists and English Quakers, all competing for every stray soul south of Puritan New England. So he comes, Halle's the pinnacle of pedagogical order, and this is where he shows up. It was not what he had hoped for. So we get cultural clash, and I don't think you can read it, but this is the placard that shows that he ends up taking over, Muhlenberg took over in 1742, Daniel Faulkner's benighted call in New Hanover. What the Halle missionaries couldn't know from across the ocean was that they were about to travel back 2 centuries in terms of confessional order. The parallels between 18th century Pennsylvania were stronger with 16th century Württemberg than 18th century Prussia-Saxony. Money and educated men were both in short supply, thus, like Weiser, they made do with whomever was available, and those with ordination and expectations of living in situ found themselves perpetually disappointed. In Pennsylvania, Weiser became the prize of all the factions lobbying for the label Lutheran. Moravians claimed to be Lutherans. Muhlenberg was horrified. They, of course, would say, but you're not a real Lutheran either. You're one of those Halle pietists. And of course, Dr. Wengert at dinner last night said, well, and those Württembergers were Brentzian pietisten, but everybody called everybody else a pietist as a way of saying they weren't legitimate. And I will let the theologians figure that one out. If Weiser, who was known by Anglo elites, and for his mediation at native treaties, could be won to any of these folds, that would give them supremacy. He was as close as you got to a superstar in 18th century Pennsylvania, because he was rather like Forrest Gump. He turned up everywhere because he did have all of these languages. He could speak German and English, and he had learned Mohawk and had a partner who could translate from Mohawk, named Schicklamy, who could translate into other languages. What's interesting is when he rode around with Count Zinzendorf from Saxony, fairly certain the Swabian and the Saxon dialect did not go down well. They didn't hit it off. But Muhlenberg paid the Weiser family a visit, and he came away with a wife. And the rest, as they say, is history. The marriage made possible the ministerium. Now, all of you will know much about the founding of the ministerium in 1748, and it meant many things, too many, and there are others in this space far better qualified to address those. However, among its momentous achievements, and most important to me today, was a fundamental overturning of the Treaty of Westphalia 40 years before Madison penned the 10th Federalist. The ministerium was a synod without the backing or adherence to the boundaries of a state. Muhlenberg had done what Birkenmeier could never do. He had brought institutional order with remarkable rapidity, but he remained a Frankian in a 16th century Brentzian environment. In other words, he didn't have status control. They had the Swedes at the ordination. They were talking across the Dutch and the German and the Scandinavian Lutherans, and they were talking across colonial boundaries. So that area on the map I showed you before, they're reaching up into New York, they're reaching down into Maryland and even Virginia over time. The problem becomes, when I said it was the Wild West, it wasn't only Muhlenberg who thought so. There was great concern about the German immigrants on the western border and the fact that they had indeed come from the parts of Germany that had been traded back and forth between Catholic France and Protestant princes for a very long time. And Benjamin Franklin, in his inimitable and insulting form, wrote at length about his concerns. And in Europe, the Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, and Swedes are generally of what we call a swarthy complexion, as are the Germans. Also, the Saxons only excepted, who with the English make the principal body of the white people on the face of the earth. So now the Germans aren't just unruly, they're at risk of being treated with the same level of utter lack of morality of African Americans and Native Americans. He goes on. Those who come hither are generally of the most ignorant, stupid sort of their own nation. And as ignorance is often attended with credulity when knavery would mislead it, and with suspicion when honesty would set it right, and as few of the English understand the German language, and so cannot address them either from the press or the pulpit, 'tis almost impossible to remove any prejudices they once entertain. Their own clergy have very little influence over the people, who seem to take an uncommon pleasure in abusing and discharging the minister on every trivial occasion. Not being used to liberty, they know not how to make modest use of it. And as Colbin says of the young Hottentots, that they are not esteemed men till they have shown their manhood by beating their mothers. So these seem to think themselves not free till they can feel their liberty in abusing and insulting their teachers. This was not what anyone wanted to have written about their community. In 1755, again, Forrest Gump, aka Conrad Weiser, appears again. This time, Benjamin Franklin has decided that he can fix the problem. They are going to build German charity schools. Never mind that Henry Muhlenberg and Birkenmeier and other Lutherans and German Reformed and so forth, and Moravians have all been trying to do this for some time now. It's Franklin, he can fix it. So he writes in the paper, with co-signed by Weiser, instruction of the poor Germans by a society of noblemen and gentlemen in London. So at least their rhetoric should be good. Situated in a dark and barren region with almost none to instruct them or their helpless children, they were easy prey to the total ignorance of their savage neighbors, corruptions of our Jesuitical enemies, which is frankly the thing they're most worried about, on whom there are already perhaps too many mixed among them. And he wants to qualify the Germans for all the advantages of native English subjects before they fall prey to the error and slavery of our restless enemies, in a time of danger when a popish enemy has advanced far into our country, even unto your very doors. And in these schools, he wishes them to be bilingual. He wishes to teach English and what he calls Dutch. Now, this is very much a moment of the outbreak of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, depending on which side of the Atlantic you study history. The Germans, immigrants, clerics don't particularly want this, but the divide exists again between what parents want and what those who teach want. In Germany, in Württemberg in the 16th century, if you went into Stuttgart, the problem was those Tradespeople wanted their children to learn math. That was their priority because they wanted them to take over the family business. And it irritated the clerics no end because they wanted to teach languages in Latin, and they couldn't persuade. Here, the German clerics would like to preserve the German language and Latin, but English now seems to be the passport to legitimacy. Muhlenberg reinvigorates his efforts trying to deal with, what he calls the unruly, ill-mannered, and godless children surrounding him in Pennsylvania, and he has some charming metaphors for how one ought to achieve this. Teaching, he writes, is like trying to hold water in a sieve. As soon as one turns around, the water is gone and the sieve is dry. So, he says, crack open the nuts and chew them until they are, and then put them into the mouths of children so that they can assimilate the nuts and turn them into chyle, because if you do not, they will lose them by natural processes of elimination without deriving any good. Turn them over in their mouth and spit, or they will turn them over in their mouth and spit them out altogether. But how he likens teaching the children of Pennsylvania is like trying to govern and check horses, mules, oxen, wolves, bears, swine, dogs, and cats with silken threads. What I find particularly interesting when we come back to the challenges of a clerical life is that they are still paying school teachers 5 shillings in 1760. That's what they were paying them in the 1560s. So no increase in pay. But what really bothers Muhlenberg is that he thinks Franklin is right. You know, in his writings previous to this and his complaints about what's going on in the schools and in the churches and in what follows, respectability is on his mind. And he writes that respectable English and German people are saying that never before have they seen such unmannerly conduct in the city. This is after a bunch of schoolboys have a really big schoolyard brawl. And to frame it in the broader sociological context, before Muhlenberg showed up, and even during that period of 43 to 48 when he's trying to take control, there are fistfights over the shared congregational space of Dutch or German Reformed and German Lutherans. And in Tulpenhagen, they're having a huge brouhaha between the Moravians and the Lutherans, which is part of why Weiser becomes so involved. And in fact, when he chooses sides and lets his daughter marry Muhlenberg, he is fairly certain a Moravian contingency has come and thrown flame, tried to burn his house down in the middle of the night. So the level of vitriol that is surrounding and anxiety that surrounds this shouldn't be undervalued. It's humorous, and yet it was deadly serious. So now we have, remember that the only people that Benjamin Franklin thought were white from Germany were the Saxons. Well, fortunately, Halle is in Saxony, and that's where Muhlenberg came from. So this is part of why Muhlenberg can cope with the slander, is he doesn't think very much of the Schwabs himself. And as we close in on the revolution, the Saxon ascendancy comes back. So we have here, I'm not sure that you can see just how well they have done in achieving their respectability, because these are honorary degree holders from the University of Pennsylvania. And up there with these Halle-called and Halle-trained ministers are, minor figures like Thomas Paine. They've made it. So, Johann Christoph Kunze follows in the wake of Henry Melchior Muhlenberg and has figured out this marriage politics. He marries Muhlenberg's daughter. He had studied in Halle with her brothers. So he comes back with the Weiser Muhlenberg sons from Halle, goes and stays at their house, promptly marries their sister, and he sets about to finally try to achieve the level of education that Dr. Wengert was describing so beautifully this morning. He wants Latinate education for Pennsylvania use, and from 1773 to 1777, when the British invaded, and he conveniently got a call to go teach at Columbia University, he tries to set up a Latin school. Justus, you will see it, both Justus Henry Christian Helmut, Justus Christoph Heinrich Helmut, but the guy on the right, was an orphan boy who proved Halle's promise of meritocratic progression from the Waisenhaus through the university possible. And he arrived in 1779 to insist on the use of German from the pulpit, then organized German-Latin training to get boys into the University of Pennsylvania, and succeeded only a year later. But while this Saxon ascendancy is taking place, they are now doing visitations in the Philadelphia Synod along the lines of what they did in 16th century Württemberg, where they're sending folks out to investigate what's going on in local schools and local churches. And one report from, this is in 1785, from Friedrich Valentine Melsheimer, comes back from Lancaster. He's spoken with 84 students in the doleful and decayed schools, where he finds very few of the young people can read, and Bible, hymn book, and catechism are books they cannot use nor know how to use. Their parents, he thought, had sunken into such a dull, dead condition that the first and simplest divine truths are far beyond their powers of comprehension. But despite this, I mean, these guys are remarkably optimistic because they never have anything. I can only think of one case where they come back and they're like, yes, the kids knew their stuff. Most of the time, it's just hand-wringing. But despite this grim report, Melsheimer adheres to the Sesame Street thesis. He still believed that schools were going to be the solution, capable of bringing, quote, moral influence to congregations and overcoming the moral indifference of parents. Because in his mind, the problem in the New World was the parents had inherited property, but without the knowledge of how to make good and wise use of the same. And this is the distinction from the visitation reports in 16th century Württemberg. Nobody is saying that the parents are too rich and spoiled. That is not a complaint. What instead happens is that the parents are so destitute that they are suggesting that schoolboys who have done well go and visit the impoverished, and that these would be poor boys themselves, and that they could be paid in bread, but at least that way someone would give a prayer at the dinner table. And so the mode is shifting to one of material wealth leading away from spiritual soundness. How this plays out in this new world is, to my mind, always best exemplified by the 4th of July celebration in 1785, where the German singing school goes through the streets and deep in the wonderful archives of the Lutheran Seminary in Philadelphia, in the basement in Mount Airy, you can still go and look at the initial handbills that they had. But in my translation, which I will accept all corrections of idiom and nuance, but basically, he stand with us and our plans, and brings the freedom train, he being God. Expel the sinful night, which well you can in freedom find. Proud Britain's scornful cries affect us no longer, we are free. But you see, in that balance between inculcating respect for authority and the dangers of freedom that have pervaded the 18th century experience of Lutheran America. So now we get the dynastic Saxon ascendancy, the Muhlenberg-Weiser dynasty, and you all probably know these faces already, but it is striking to me that they all have beautiful oil portraits, including Gotthilf Heinrich Ernst's portrait by Peel. Whereas I can't show you a face of Wilhelm Birkenmeier. I can't show you a face of Conrad Weiser. These guys never quite crossed the Rubicon of legitimacy to have those portraits taken. That's why I just can show you a signature. So Frederick, the New York pastor turned politician, who chaired the 1787 ratification debates, and what did he do? So not only did they print those debates in the Constitution up for ratification in German, because they were concerned about how large a portion of the population was German literate, he took them all to visit his father's school down the street in Philadelphia. So next time you watch 1776, and see all those guys in wigs, I like to imagine all those English-speaking wig wearers going down to see these German children who were sometimes rewarded with pretzels for their good behavior. John Peter Gabriel, everyone knows the perhaps apocryphal, not certain, tale of his standing behind the pulpit, ripping off his robes to have his military gear behind, was down in Virginia, proving yet again that the boundaries of church and state had taken a different form. And then we have Gotthelf Heinrich Ernst, who is the most significant in terms of the long-term trajectory of how school-level education is taking place, because he writes at length about how he thinks bilingual education should happen. He believes fervently that the mother tongue should come first. And he's the person to whom I refer most frequently in conversations about contemporary schooling, where we think so frequently about bilingual education, because he beat us by a few centuries in working this out. So his proposed curriculum was that the first class would cover English, reading, writing, and scientific language. The second class would cover German for the German school. The third class would cover Latin and Greek and use them for the higher sciences. And in this breakdown, where he's got a separate sort of timetable, how this aligns, I've never figured out exactly, but the afternoon is for mathematics, so don't worry, it's not being left out. And he is there, as is Helmut, in 1787 at the founding of Franklin College, which covers in its curriculum as written English, German, Latin, Greek, divinity, sciences, and arts. So in other words, these inheritors of Reformation pedagogy have finally built a college. They had experimented with the academy at the University of Pennsylvania. They've now set it up, but what is striking is by coming out to Lancaster, coming out to the area that was more heavily settled by the Schwabs and where Gotthelf Heinrich Ernst was more open to bilingual education, it gets institutionalized here first, because the difference is Helmut in Philadelphia is more strictly adherent to German and Latin, less interested in diversifying the curriculum in those ways. So what happens is a radical breach with 2.5 centuries of transatlantic competition and condemnation. Because at the founding of Franklin College, you have not only justices of the peace, but Presbyterian elders, and most critically, Catholics processing for the college opening. And to my mind, this is as close as you could come in 18th century Pennsylvania Lutheran circles to a facsimile of the diversity on Sesame Street. So I think I managed to catch up on our time so that I'm not keeping anyone from lunch.